Well, thank you, everybody. It's kind of nice that we have a cozy little group here, so we can be more informal. I'm going to tell you a story tonight. It's a true story of a very special place called Liberty Hill, Camas Bluff. My part in the story is really small, but I hope to give you a glimpse of a longer tale that goes way back, perhaps for millennia. Let's go back in time to the 19th century, about 200 years ago. Early surveys of the Willamette Valley reported over 1 million acres of oak savanna wildflower meadows, like the one pictured here. 1 million acres. It's hard to conceive. They were so vast that from a distance, Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition thought the valley consisted of lakes of clear water, until they got closer and realized they were viewing fields of the blue-flowered Camassia in bloom. In 1806, Lewis wrote, "The camas is now in bloom, and from the color of its bloom at a short distance, it resembles lakes of fine, clear water. So complete is this deception that on first sight, I could have sworn it was water." The botanical name of the flowering bulb that they were viewing is Camassia camas, also known as camas or camas lily. Camas was the first people's name for it, or at least how Lewis and Clark understood it. A later explorer, Reverend George Gary, who experienced the oak savanna in spring, spoke eloquently of the awe-inspiring sight when he noted in 1845 that it is like a flower garden indeed, in a large scale, to an extent unmeasured, and it hardly seems right that our horses should step. Although Lewis and Clark noted the first people's practice of controlled burns in their journals, many of the early explorers and pioneers thought that they were traveling through untouched wilderness. Actually, these meadows were the result of long-established management by indigenous tribes. The tribes used controlled burns to maintain the meadows for hunting and gathering, as we learned from Greg Archuleta of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde in his fascinating presentation last week. The burns prevented plants like Douglas fir from taking over the meadow. The widely spaced, stately Gary oak trees common on Oregon's oak savanna can tolerate low-intensity fires. The oaks are a rich source of high-protein acorns, and their dappled shade accommodates the meadow wildflowers. The nuts, grains, and bulbs of the meadows were a food source for indigenous peoples, and many medicinal plants grew there as well. Now these meadows are gone, except for a few small patches on land unsuitable for farming or development. Liberty Hill, Camas Bluff, near the town of St. Helens, is one of the few intact meadows left, and its future is uncertain. A conservation group called Friends of Liberty Hill was formed by Larissa Hewson, who we will hear from later, to advocate for preserving this special place. She will share the current state of those efforts. Last year, I completed a series of 12 botanical studies that included 44 plants and some of their pollinators from the meadow ecosystem. They're on display, as you probably noticed, at the back of the room. I wanted to document some of the botanical treasures and use the sketches to publicize the plight of the property on social media. I hope to eventually develop the sketches into some paintings. The 44 plants that I documented are a very small representation of the over 3,000 plants that have been identified on the property by botanists and naturalists. My purpose was to record my own impressions and experiences on the property as a botanical artist, rather than creating a comprehensive visual record. I will take you through the growing season with me through my sketches. On my visit in March, the earthy yet delicate fragrance of spring washes over me as I crest the hill that leads to the field. I take deep breaths, but feel I can't fill my lungs enough with the smell of growing things, although all I see is dry grasses and a low carpeting of green moss, until I bend down and look more closely. Grassland saxifrage, gold star, and a few scattered camas lilies bloom in March. The lance-leaved stonecrop leaves glow in the late afternoon sunlight. That's what they are. Most of the flowers in the meadow are exceedingly small and easy to overlook at this time of year. In my drawings, I magnified the tiny annual called Gold Star 1.5 times. That's this drawing. And 5 times for the blossom. And then I recorded the pigments I used here and right here for future reference. I tried to capture the glowing colors of the leaves of the sedum, magnified 5 times in my watercolor sketch. A distinctive feature of the property is an old wagon trail right here that has left a permanent track through the thin soil. In spring, vernal streams weave their way to the cliff and become a waterfall. The thin soil becomes saturated as water seeps towards the bluff and down to a creek below and eventually to the Columbia River. In a few weeks, this ordinary-looking field will be covered with wildflowers. Camas lily, farewell to spring, columbine, candy flower, shooting star, and more. In early April, the camas lily buds emerge. They give the meadow a shimmering haze of blue that stretches into the distance as the blossoms wave in the breeze. Walking through the meadow is like stepping on a sponge, soft and very wet after the recent rains. Even the rocks are soft, covered with a plush carpet of chartreuse moss. The craggy Gary oak branches are still bare. The oaks grow back from the bluff where the soil is deeper. Their dappled shade creates its own unique ecosystem. Although only a few Camassia are in bloom, the buds are quite beautiful, with many shades of blue and purple in a small package. I used 6 different pigments to paint this bud, all these pigments here. And bright monkey flowers are in bloom as well. They're one of the first flowers to bloom and one of the last as well. In my sketches, I record plant form, color, pigments used, and I'm doing a few dissections to help me understand the blossom form, and because it's just fascinating. This is a cross-section of a monkey flower showing the ovary and stamen. Oops, sorry. Kind of wild with my thumb there. Since in the spring, the succession of wildflowers goes very quickly, in the interest of time and to keep the freshness of a sketchbook, I draw right onto my watercolor paper in the field as much as possible. I record as much as I can with light pencil drawings, then refine the drawings in my studio. Sometimes I do sketches on tracing paper, which I later transfer so I can play with composition. In this graphite rendering of an oak tree, I did the drawing right on my watercolor paper in the field, but added much of the shading later. Sometimes I go over my pencil lines with a black fine micron pen and a gray pen that I like for shading, strengthening my lines and checking details. I use reference photos to jog my memory of the details. A dizzying array of wildflowers will soon appear, some preferring the thin soil of the meadow, and others thriving in the deeper soil and shade under the patches of Gary oak and Oregon ash trees. In early April, a friend who knows the oak meadow well takes me to a grove where many checker lilies and fawn lilies grow, alongside several other treasures like prairie star, beautiful bittercress, and blue-eyed Mary. The dark checker lilies seem hidden in the dappled shade cast by the bare oak branches until I learned to discern their graceful form. The nearby bright pink bittercrest blossoms draw my eye right away. So this is the bittercrest. Since I have a fondness for checker lilies, I spend a lot of time sketching them in different positions and stages of bloom. I perch on a camping stool and sketch right onto my watercolor paper. I notice that they vary a lot in the number of checkers on the petals and in the arrangement of the leaves. The leaves may be whorled, right here, 3 or more at a node, or alternate, which gives them a dancing, twirling look. Checker lilies are also called chocolate lilies, and you can see why. That delicious, rich, chocolatey color. The light shining through the petals brings out the reddish tones and makes the green, yellow-green spots glow. I enjoy the surprises that dissections bring, like when I cut a fritillaria ovary in half and see the star shape, like here, with the immature seeds in double rows between the points, and the thin neck of the filament holding up the anther of the stamen. In my studio, I use a magnifying lens on my camera, and sometimes in the field too, or a celestron microscope to see the tiny details. I only pick flowers in areas where I have permission from the caregiver, or I buy native plants at a nursery to study, and I have some native plants in my garden that I use as reference as well. I use a photographer's gray card right here. Here it is. To help the camera focus, focus on the subject, and to increase color accuracy. Although I work from live plants as much as possible, as I mentioned, I use the reference photos for details. And then I use color swatches to make notes, right there are my color swatches, to make notes on what pigments are closest to the plant color. In mid-April, the weather is warming, and now the Camassia meadows are thick with flowers. The meadow stretches out blue into the distance, densely packed with camas blossoms. Yellow buttercups, Oregon sunshine, and lomatium dot the blue field with occasional swaths of pink rosy plectritis. Tiny native bees and big buzzy bumblebees seem frenzied as they go from blossom to blossom. Now that the camas flower petals have opened, I not only have the challenge of capturing the many shades of blue, magenta, and purple in each flower, but become aware that the color of the blossom changes in different light. Note how the Camassia spent flower petals splay out right here. The significance, I'll tell you about it later. The candy flower grows in a shady spot where the soil is deep and wet. It winds its way up through the grasses. This right here is candy flower. It still feels like I'm walking on a sponge wherever I go in the fields. Shallow seasonal streams weave towards the bluff and host their own ecosystem of unique plants. As I do more of these studies, I start to play with composition ideas, trying to weave the plants together on the page like they grow in the field. I don't know if you can see how my pages change as we go along. Fawn lilies, shooting star, see, oops, I'm supposed to change, now we're on the next slide, mid-April. Fawn lilies, shooting stars, spring gold, prairie stars. Don't you just love wildflower names? Their whimsical common names fit these charming little beauties. These plants all bloom in mid-April. Oregon fawn lily, sweet vernal grass, western trillium, and prairie star all grow in the dappled shade of the oaks. Silvery blue butterflies here like to sun themselves in the path through the meadows or on rocks in the seasonal streams. It's always a delight to see them. The common name silvery blue seems obvious and fitting, but I wonder about the name fawn lily. Maybe referring to the speckled leaves? Here, like a fawn? I don't know. It's late April in the meadow. I never would have noticed the naked broom rape if Larissa hadn't pointed it out to me. It's right here, this little guy. Its diminutive size of 4 or 5 inches makes it easy to overlook, but what a fascinating plant. The blossom reminds me of the phonograph horn and the old RCA ads. The plant has no leaves, so it can't photosynthesize on its own, but its roots attach to those of the saxifrage or a few other plants, so it can feed off their system of photosynthesis. But it doesn't seem to harm its host plant at all. As if the almost neon color and exotic rocket shape of the blossoms of the shooting star were not enough, I learned that they are pollinated by something called buzz pollination. Bumblebees grasp onto the tube and vibrate their wings with just little short vibrations. Then the sound waves dislodge the pollen down onto the bee. So they're pollinated by the sound, loosened by the sound waves. The bumblebee then grooms the sticky pollen off its body into a ball on its leg and moves on to the next blossom. You can see videos of it on YouTube of them doing this. The meadow has become lush under the clouds and rainy weather of early May. Stately great camas, Camassia leclinii, has a queenly presence over the smaller wildflowers. It grows on stout stems up to 48 inches tall. I saw a stand of it for the first time when I peeked into an ordinary looking grove of shrubby ash trees. And to my surprise and delight, the purple spires grew thickly throughout the grove, poking up through the tall grasses. It was like walking by an ordinary looking house and opening the door and looking into an elegant room of purple and green. The bright yellow western buttercup intertwines itself with the deep purple spires of the great camas for a lively mix of complementary colors. The spent petals of the great camas twist around the ovary in this really distinctive way. So that's one way of identifying that particular variety of camas. The other camas species' dried petals kind of splay out from the ovary, as I mentioned before. The tough leaf iris and great camas seem to favor moist dappled shade, but buttercups will grow almost anywhere moist. Buttercups. The tough leaf iris and great camas seem to, I said that. Early explorer David Douglas notes in his journal that first peoples wove these iris leaves into snares for trapping, and they were strong enough to hold animals as large as elk. In late May, the bright orange columbine flowers stand out in the meadow like beacons. The blossoms of this plant are favorites of hummingbirds and butterflies. Besides providing nectar for butterflies, like the sylvan hairstreak here, columbine has medicinal properties. The pulp from the roots helped sores to heal, and the chewed leaves were spat on sores by indigenous peoples. I found this information and other indigenous uses of plants in Pojar and McKinnon's book. They did extensive research with Native peoples and really incredible amount of information in here. And and the book is great for plant ID as well. And another favorite is Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest for plant ID. So I think I rely on these two books most of all. Besides the columbine, another plant whose nectar is favored by butterflies is the Nooka rose. Also, both hairstreak and morning cloak butterflies feed on Nooka rose leaves. Many parts of the rose were used by first peoples in cookery and medicine. I find Nooka rose blossoms to be the most fragrant of any rose that I know of, cultivated or native. A voluptuous scent worthy of a Parisian perfumery. In the intertwined ecosystem of the meadow, the tomcat clover enriches the soil here by fixing nitrogen. The wild roses host butterfly larvae, and the butterflies in turn pollinate the meadow plants. Each part of the ecosystem is dependent on the rest. In late June, the meadow grasses are flowering and losing the lush greenness of spring. The seed heads wave in the breeze above the buff-colored blades of grass. Although the flowers are more scattered, a few species are making a fine show. Even on the rockiest, driest hillside, farewell to spring, heal all, here, harvest rhodea, here, and Oregon sunshine still bloom. Drifts of Oregon sunshine truly do light up the meadow like rays of light. Oops. Uh-oh. I did something. Sorry.
Where are you supposed to be? In July?
Late June.
I'll find it. While researching, I found that varieties of heal-all grow all around the world. And everywhere they grow, it grows. It has a long history of medicinal use. Europe, Asia, heal-all grows there. Indigenous peoples boil the whole plant to make tea to strengthen the heart, use the leaves on cuts, bruises, and skin inflammations, and added the crushed leaves to grease to make an ointment. Again, all this information from Pojar's book. It's a great book. The husky yellow-faced bumblebee is still busy harvesting nectar and pollinating in the process. For you artists, I found that mixing perline green and perline violet make a nice deep black for the bumblebees. As a model for this sketch, I used a bumblebee that I collected from the sidewalk. When I find, little boys think I'm so cool. When I find dead bees or other insects, I save them for future reference. I put them in a bag in the freezer for several days to clean them of mites, and then save them in a little container. My husband sometimes has a little surprise when he's searching through the freezer, but he's a good sport. Nettles, larkspur, here, grows in the dappled shade under the ash trees. The cobalt blossoms have a velvety purple cast that is very difficult to capture. At least I found it so. For the artists here, I use quinacridone magenta as a first wash, putting purple in the center of the blossom with cobalt washes on top, and stronger blue at the tips. For the harvest rhodea, I use quinacridone lilac as a first wash with cobalt washes on top. I love those quin pigments. I find that for flower petals, washes of single pigments keep the colors fresher than washes of a mixed pigment of the color I want. It's better to adjust it with single washes of different pigments. When I walk through the dry brown meadow in mid-July, it seems barren. At close look, I begin to see the delicate beauty of the seed pods. Some are obvious to identify, like the monkey flower and the great camas. Here's the great camas. Here's the monkey flower. And others brought questions to explore and try to ID later. I have a whole table full of dried seed pods from the meadow that I want to identify sometime. The moisture-loving monkey flower has formed delicate pods packed with tiny seeds now that the vernal seed streams have dried in the summer heat. Much to my surprise, I find some demure ladies' tresses orchids blooming in the heat and drought of the meadow. Here. Their blossoms radiate around the stem, resembling long braided hair. They grow alongside the old wagon trail that I use as a path. Their pure white blossoms look surprisingly fresh and in contrast to the dry brown grasses all around. The orchids bloom near a stand of trees, which give them a bit of shade and perhaps are an indication of moisture deep in the soil. Meadow's foot trefoil is forming pea-like seed pods. Here. Although a few blossoms do remain. You can see how they get the name bird's foot from the splayed out pods. The snowberry has both blossoms and berries. Sometimes on the same stem. They grow in the shade of the oaks as well. The dried grasses are brittle and broken now, but the great camas pod still stands stiffly to attention. When I touch the pods, I can hear the seeds rattling inside. The mason bee is one of the many solitary bees native to the Pacific Northwest. Each female builds her own nest in a hollow twig, under bark, or in an abandoned beetle hole, using mud or chewed plant material. Larsa told me about Yampa, and in August, I'm delighted to find several stands of their white, fluffy umbels floating over the meadow, bouncing in the breeze. Yampa is also known as wild carrot, and as the name indicates, was a food source for indigenous peoples. They ground the roots to make flour, which according to Lewis and Clark tasted not unlike aniseed. Many of us are familiar with the non-native Queen Anne's lace that grows abundantly in our fields and roadsides, but these, they're also in the carrot family, but these native wild carrots are much more delicate, lacy, and fresh looking. The stands of Oregon white oak give shelter to smaller ash trees and many shrubs that fruit in the autumn and are important food for wildlife getting ready for winter. Western dogwood, Saskatoon, and oval leaf viburnum. Here's the dogwood, Saskatoon, and viburnum. All fruit this time of year in the dappled shade of the oaks. I hear that Saskatoon berries make wonderful jam. Never tried it, but. In the autumn, the shape of the land and the silhouette of the trees stand out, since the distraction of summer's lush greenery is gone. The old wagon trail draws the eye over the hillocks, and the craggy branches of the oak tree stand out against the sky. The rainy season has begun, and the vernal streams in the meadow are beginning to flow. The mosses are becoming soft and green again. Licorice fern are dormant in the summer, but become lush in winter when so much else is dry and brown. These ferns carpet the woodland floor, spreading by branch-like rhizomes, which really do have a licorice flavor. I tried them. Little tinge of dirt flavor in there too, but they're pretty licoricey. Licorice ferns are common in Portland street trees, if you've noticed them. They kind of look like a green mantle over the huge branches way up high in our older trees. I dissected one of the Nootka rose hips to see the seeds nestled inside and was surprised that the seeds are covered by these tiny silky hairs. And don't you just love those long, elegant sepals? At the bottom of the page is one of the most common native plants of the woodland, poison oak. The leaves are variable, but usually resemble the leaves of Gary oak trees. Kind of tricky, because they usually grow right under the oak trees. Poison oak does turn a beautiful red color in autumn, then they lose its leaves. And any of you hikers know that even brushing against the bare twigs can cause a terrible, painful rash that lasts as long as 2 weeks. I carefully try to avoid touching any part of this plant, but even so, it's almost impossible when I'm exploring or sketching in the woods. It's just right, it's all over. So a friend recommended, I'll give you a tip, washing with Technu. It's a cleansing cream cleansing soap developed by OSU specifically for dissolving poison oak oil. It's worked great for getting the oil off my skin, gear, and clothes. Sometimes I just wash down everything when I get home. So remember, if you see leaves of 3, let it be. When a friend first took me to Liberty Hill, Camas Bluff in 2016, the 100-acre property was a closely guarded secret, known only to local botanists and wildflower enthusiasts. Although the meadow is on private property, it's zoned public access allowed by the corporation that owns it. But the locals feared that too many visitors would cause the corporation to close access. The property has now been leased to a gravel mining company, and they are in the final stages of getting the needed permits to start scraping off the soil and blasting into the rock. I'm not against gravel mining, but the salt is abundant in this region, and there are many other less sensitive and significant properties to use for this purpose. I'm so grateful that I had the privilege of spending time exploring and sketching on this beautiful property. It gives me a glimpse of the glory of the former vast meadows of this region. I hope that one day it will be a nature preserve so that others can enjoy it, be inspired, and be reminded that nature's treasures need to be protected and preserved for future generations. Over the years, a group called Friends of Liberty Hill has made innumerable attempts at preserving this unique, rare, and historically important ecosystem. Now I would like to introduce Larissa Hewson, who founded Friends of Liberty Hill. She knows this property intimately, much better than I do, and has been an important spokesperson and leader in preserving the Camas meadows. Please welcome her. So Larissa, please bring us up to speed on the preservation efforts.
Thanks everybody for coming. It's really wonderful to see the photos and Janine's beautiful drawings, and just her. Let's see. You kind of came to me through Elise Lansing.
Yeah, who lives in Scappoose.
Yeah.
And a friend who was a local is how I found out about this.
So I've known Janene for the last couple of years, and I was just like over the moon when I found out that a botanical artist would have taken a keen interest in the area. So that's really wonderful. So a little bit of my background, like Janene, I spent my entire life in the Pacific Northwest and spent a lot of my childhood running around the woods. So I grew up in Southwest Washington, near the Cowlitz River, and so I was really more of like a skunk-gathered swamp and western red cedar and alder type woods type person. So when I first had kind of a glimpse of this type of habitat when I was 11, and my brother and I discovered this very similar to Liberty Hill place just south of Kalama, Washington. And it's a hillside. You can see it up there off of I-5 if you're heading north. It's just on the right side. But there was camas up there and checker lily and all these wildflowers. And I was just blown away. And for many years, I thought that was just something unique until I learned about Liberty Hill in 2013. And then, I was just blown away all over again, and started visiting the place and just documenting the plants. So from between 2013 and then 2018, I started to kind of hear these rumblings about, the Liberty Hill, the plans to quarry it. And so I started learning more about that, and then in 2018, things really started to move forward. In that, Knife River Corporation is the mining company that, is leasing the property from Weyerhaeuser, who's actually the owner. They've been the owner since 2013. And, so they started the permit application at that point, and so they had a pre-application meeting with Department of State Lands, to kind of figure out their plans. And so that started the wheels turning, and so that's when I started to advocate for the place and gathered together a group of citizens from both Portland and a lot of them live in Scappoose, St. Helens area. And so we started to organize and come up with a plan of how to push back and try to get this place saved. And it's a major uphill battle. I mean, battling a mine is not, it's not an easy thing to shut down. But fortunately, there are processes that a mining permit needs to go through. And so this past February, Knife River did submit an application for the mining permit. And that goes to 3 different agencies. It goes to Department of State Lands, it goes to the Army Corps of Engineers, and then also goes to DEQ. And so all 3 of those agencies, they have public comment periods that are opened up after each agency has had a chance to look at the application. And so in February, we were able to mobilize many people, and I think, so Army Corps of Engineers was the first agency to open it up to public comment, and my best guess is that we had between 60 and 100 public comment letters written and submitted to the Army Corps of Engineers, which also went to DEQ. So that was pretty significant, especially I heard from DEQ that they don't usually get any comments at all. And now that there is public interest on it, they are going to have a public hearing eventually. And this is just kind of generally going to kind of delay the process. So I know that in the application, Knife River had wanted to start like now, late summer or fall, and that's not happening. The other encouraging news is that when Department of State Lands received the application, they decided that it was too incomplete. Because Liberty Hill has lots of wetlands and streams, you have to mitigate for those. So if you're gonna impact them, which they would, I mean, their original plans was to quarry, I believe, 130 acres of the 200 acres that Liberty Hill is. But these streams and pools are all kind of interconnected. It's really complicated. So their mitigation plan was, it just didn't really address what they were going to impact. So it was returned. The application was returned by Department of State Lands, and then they were given a May 15th date to resubmit the application with more information on the mitigation. They haven't done that yet. So, you know, we're not out of the woods yet, but our group has made an impact. Eventually, Department of State Lands, when and if they get the application back, they too will have a public comment period. And if any of you are interested in participating in that. It's very easy. You just write a letter to them and send it. I brought cards tonight, and it has we have a website that has information and lots and lots and lots of photos of Liberty Hill on it. So if anyone wants to be directly involved, there are opportunities to do that in the future. Doing what I can for this place that just get emotional. It really is beautiful and special, and it's like Janene was saying. I mean, it's just really absolutely ridiculous that they are destroying this place for rock, as particularly basalt, which is the entire Pacific Northwest is filled with it. So, do you have any questions? Yes.
Should Friends of Liberty Hill win the battle, what would become of the land?
Well, ideally, and we are just because we not really sure what's going to happen, but ideally, because Weyerhaeuser is a property owner and they're leasing it to Knife River right now, they're gonna need to do something with it. Another part of our fear is like they might wanna try to develop part of it. Even though, our group, who is familiar with the property, we can clearly see that it is not really a great place to put houses. Because most of the soil is only inches deep. And how you put utilities in that, I'm not sure. So it would be really expensive to develop. One of our group members who lives out there even asked one of the local developers who is very active in the area if he would be interested in building there, and he said it would be too costly. It just would not even be worth it. But all that said, we're hoping that eventually, and if the mining is prevented, that Weyerhaeuser will either grant it into conservation or provide some place like Columbia Land Trust or a land trust to acquire it. And we actually did involve Columbia Land Trust back in 2018, and they even met with Weyerhaeuser, and it was looking really good until Weyerhaeuser went back and met with some of the mining rights people or mining industry. They have the whole section of Weyerhaeuser that just deals with like lands that they have that have minerals on it. And they decided that they didn't want to renegotiate the list and at that time. And so they're just kind of sitting on it. Yeah.
So any other questions? We should have warned you before to start. Do we have a Q&A?
What about endangered species on the land? Is that a concern?
We've been trying to find them. Yeah, but the thing of it is that just the property on a whole, just as from an ecological standpoint, and the diversity of plants there native plants there is amazing. I think Janene mentioned 3,000, not quite that many. So we have a plant list going, and so far, and there's invasive species there too. As far as native plants go, there's approximately 250 native plant species there. And we're talking about dry species that grow in the meadows, and then there's wetland species too. There's a type of yellow loosestrife that used to be prevalent all along the Columbia. It's fringe loosestrife, and there's a specific kind of bee that pollinates this plant.
Well, I looked at the spreadsheet, and it had that many.
3,000?
Yeah,
Whoa.
but maybe they weren't all natives.
Yeah.
That could have been it.
Yeah, so anyway, just, so we haven't, there are a lot of plants there that are uncommon. Some of the plants, like, there's a little teeny tiny campanula type plant, it's called Justopsis specularioides. And it only grows about 3 inches tall, and it has a tiny little cup-shaped flower. It's called common blue cup, it's not common. It grows on Liberty Hill, but the next closest places that it's been found are like in southern Oregon or northern California. The Chrysidium multicaulis, the little gold stars that Jean had in her presentation. There is, I think, still a spot maybe over in Kalama where they still are, but Liberty Hill has one of the last populations for miles around of that little tiny little beautiful plant. And so a lot of the plants that grow there, they're next found in protected places in the gorge or down the Willamette Valley. So it's just really an unusual and special place. And so
It's really a
Yeah.
rare ecosystem.
It
You
is,
know, even though
it
there's
is,
not
yeah.
maybe individual rare plants,
Right.
the ecosystem itself is rare.
And you know, the birds, and we just completed a study of pollinators. One of our group members got permission from Weyerhaeuser to put out a blue vein trap and trap some bees a couple years ago, and those just were studied, and I just got the list. So there were a few unusual bee species there. And then birds, I saw the first indigo bunting of my life out on Liberty Hill. I walked up to one of the streams and it was taking a bath down in there. So we've had birder groups go out there, and so far I think we've documented 80 some native birds that frequent the hill. I've seen the most western tanagers there in my entire life together, all in one. I think of what else has been exciting, has been going on with the other species. Oh, fairy shrimp. Has anybody ever heard of those?
What is it?
Fairy shrimp. You guys remember like the comic books where you could order sea monkeys? Okay, that's the same, similar species. So, really interesting. I found these in one of the wetlands this past spring. I was just looking around more for plants, but I found these weird little bug things. And so, captured some, took some pictures of it, put it on iNaturalist, and then it just generated a flurry of excitement of these people that were talking about these fairy shrimp. And so, they're not rare. There are some species in southern Oregon that are endangered. I sent a sample of one of these off to University of Kansas. I was gonna send it to OSU, but their lab, it's been under remodel, and so all their specimens for reference were in storage, and so I sent it down to Kansas. It was identified as, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of that. Branchipus, it's not Bundy eye, it's not the other one. But it's one of the 3 species or so that are in Oregon. And in our region, the northern Willamette Valley, it would appear that Liberty Hill is the only place that still has this population of these fairy shrimp. And I also found something in one of the vernal streams this past spring that I sent off to OSU. So there's a moss called Fontanalis antipyretica. It's an aquatic moss, and in amongst the moss where there was this weird, and I swear it was like some kind of really fine seaweed type stuff. It was like tiny little green tubes, like a chartreuse green. None of my botanist friends knew what it was. I sent a sample to OSU to some experts there. Thought maybe it was a bryophyte, but the bryophyte expert couldn't identify it. The algae expert couldn't identify it, and they still haven't. They don't really know what it is. So, you know, long story short, in my conversation with this professor, I guess it's not, to my surprise, it's not actually that uncommon to find a plant still these days that nobody knows exactly what it is. But it's pretty intriguing, so. Yeah, it's definitely has some great value as an intact ecosystem, something really pretty special.
Just a question for you, Janene, just the speed at which you were drawing it, looks like you're pretty fast, like that tree that you did, how long did that take you, and then how long did it take you to put the detail on it?
I usually when I go up on the hill, I'm up there 3 or 4 hours, so it probably took me a couple hours to do the drawing. And then maybe another, once I get the form in there, the shading doesn't take that long, so maybe an hour shading. When I get back, I just did it with pencil. Elise?
Page and page.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I was looking beyond Elise.
I'm sorry.
No, you.
Oh, okay. First of all, the sketches are just so inspiring.
Oh, thank
So
you.
beautiful. You probably already exhausted all these things, but Greg Archuleta was talking about the tribal connections to camas, to Yampa, and other things that I'm not remembering, but, is there a possibility of significance to tribal peoples?
Yeah.
That could be an avenue to pursue to make this place not go away?
Yeah, some of the tribes have been involved. And they've actually, it's kind of on the down low per their request, but they are involved. I can't
That's
really
interesting.
talk
I
too
won't
much
say
about it.
anything.
Yeah, but yeah, it is, it's been recognized as something significant by them. And that is great because the advocacy of tribal interest can mean a lot, especially with Army Corps of Engineers who needs to look at cultural resources. So that's good.
Good.
I just can't talk about it too much because they've requested that we not really discuss that part of it too much. But yeah, so that's another good thing.
Whose traditional homeland is it? So which?
This is traditional homeland of the Chinook.
Okay.
And some of the, and that whole area near St. Helens had a huge population of indigenous pre-contact. There were villages close by. There are numerous archaeological sites in the area. And you know, I mean, I would think that probably Liberty Hill was managed at one time with fire, like the annual burnings that they would do in the fall to help regenerate the camas and burn out the brush and help the oak trees there. Yeah, I mean, you just look at the area and it's just, there still aren't a lot of Douglas fir trees that grow there. That's partially because it's so dry and rocky, but it just, I think it probably was harvested and managed by them at one point in time.
Did you find any pit ovens for cooking the camas?
There was, as part of the mining application, was they had an archaeologist go in and do a site survey. And so, I know they found some things, but, because those type of reports are not made public. So I know that they did find some things there.
Any more questions? Thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Larissa.